You are listening to the IoT For All Media Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the IoT For All podcast on the IoT For All Media Network. I'm your host, Ryan Chacon, one of the co-creators of IoT For All. Now, before we jump into this episode, please don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or join our newsletter at iotforall.com/newsletter to catch all the newest episodes as soon as they come out. Before we get started, if any of you out there are looking to enter the fast-growing and profitable IoT market but don't know where to start, check out our sponsor, Leverage's IoT Solutions Development Platform, which provides everything you need to create turnkey IoT products that you can white label and resell under your own brand. To learn more, go to iotchangeseverything.com. That's iotchangeseverything.com. So, without further ado, please enjoy this episode of the IoT For All podcast. Welcome, Adam, to the IoT For All show. How are things going on your end?
Going well. Thanks for having us on, Ryan.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Let's start off by having you give a quick introduction to our audience, talk about background, experience, anything you think would give our audience more context into who they're listening to.
Sure. Adam Crossno, founder and CEO of OnAsset, been in the business of real-time supply chain visibility for about a decade and a half now, mainly coming from an engineering background. But today I get involved in everything from helping engineer our products from the ground up, and then really engaging with customers to help understand how they use our products and ultimately take that feedback into helping improve our products.
Fantastic. So on the OnAsset side of things, what do you all do exactly? And kind of where's your focus in IoT for our audience to kind of catch up to that?
So we provide real-time supply chain visibility, typically associated with high-value assets or shipments that are moving through the global supply chain. So really think about anything where you'd like to have that additional peace of mind where you can understand where something is, what's happening to it, who has possession of it, and really all of those kind of end-to-end things involved in moving product from one location to another, that you want to be able to be alerted on anything that's not going according to plan, or just generally see all of your assets moving so you can do supply chain planning based on when those assets are arriving or departing.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And tell me a little bit about the story behind kind of founding the company. So, what were you doing before? What opportunity did you kind of see in the market? What kind of prompted you to start OnAsset and obviously get it to where it is now?
Well, I actually started as a mechanical engineer doing robotic automation systems quite some time ago in the early 2000s. And it was actually getting involved with some of the early RFID equipment back when RFID became a real buzzword and Walmart came out trying to implement RFID through their global supply chain. We started to integrate some of the RFID equipment into those robotic systems. And we identified pretty early on that the stuff that was available in the open market was not really intended for heavy industrial applications, was not made to plug and play with those robotic automation systems. So we actually invented a modular RFID reader and filed several patents on it that would allow those kind of systems to plug and play more on the industrial manufacturing side of the world. And that was very successful for us to the point where we spun that entity off into a separate business to take that modular RFID product to market. And in the process, met several logistics companies, one of which was DHL at some RFID trade shows. And that was the point where we really got our eyes opened into the world of global logistics and all of the things involved in that. And it was a natural extension of the type of manufacturing-centric visibility we were giving people through the RFID systems. And it was really a challenge from some of the logistics providers to open up that kind of visibility into the global supply chain, but do that in a way that did not require RFID infrastructure to be installed at all of their various facilities, because there's a pretty large upfront cost associated with that. So that really got us leapfrogging from RFID technology, which traditionally requires an installed infrastructure to use, into the kind of fully autonomous cellular, satellite, Wi-Fi based type of systems that could track something from origin to destination. So effectively like a smartphone for things that you could ship around the world. And this was at the time, again, in the early to mid 2000s, prior to the smartphone really existing. So at the time, a lot of people did not believe you could have a small wireless device inside of a package and watch that as it transited the globe. But we were able to very successfully prove that. And in the process, we got involved in really understanding the regulatory landscape for the use of real-time supply chain visibility. And if you really think about the types of products people move, where they're willing to pay an extra cost to have that real-time visibility, a lot of that gravitates around the aviation or air cargo landscape because they move a lot of mission critical or high value products that need to get from one place to another quickly. And that became kind of centric to our business for a period of time. So we actually invented and patented some unique technology and had the benefit of actually being invited by the FAA to sit on the rulemaking committee for the regulatory foundation of how to use real-time tracking devices in aircraft. And that's where we kind of cut our teeth and got our reputation, and have since really expanded into the global world of supply chain visibility via all modes of transport.
Wow, that's awesome. That's a fantastic story. So I'd love it. I'd love it if you could expand on some of your more, let's say, popular or prominent, or maybe the use cases you're maybe most active in, to kind of give our audience a bit more context as to the application of your kind of technology and offering in the real world. Usually a pretty good discussion there.
Sure. Well, certainly a sector that's very, very popular for us is pharmaceutical, life science, and perishables. Really because we provide not only a service that gives you the location of your goods, but their condition as well. So if you really think about the pharmaceutical industry in general is moving toward requiring temperature regimes depending on what you're shipping. So a lot of the medicines today require, if not frozen or deep frozen transport, at least refrigerated or controlled transport. So we do a lot of work in that space. We've been heavily involved in the COVID vaccine distribution and all things there, because that is highly sensitive product, and you need to maintain that chain of custody and integrity throughout the entire shipping and storage cycle. So that's been a huge market for us. We also get involved, generally speaking, in anything that is high value or mission critical. So that can be medical equipment, high value electronics, things that are not only prone to potential damage in transit, but theft concerns, that type of thing. So in some respects, our solution is a security blanket for shipments, in addition to understanding the integrity and the quality of the shipment. So all of those things kind of roll up, and then we do some interesting things like helping manage spare parts for the aviation industry.
Okay.
If you think about mission critical, the parts themselves may not be very expensive, but they could take an aircraft out of service if they don't get somewhere quickly and in the right time and the right condition. So we do a lot of that. And then most recently, we've really gotten involved with our customers of taking traditionally non-connected assets like pallets, the unit load devices, the ULDs that store luggage and cargo inside aircraft, even temperature controlled shipping packages, and really taking our technology and integrating it into those systems so that you create kind of connected tools of the trade. So it's not just the individual shipment you're tracking, but actually the conveyance or what's storing or handling those shipments.
Right.
And most recently, we've actually expanded our solution into the warehousing as well. So we can provide that true kind of end-to-end visibility at all points in storage or in motion as it changes hands, and do that on a global basis, which has certainly been a challenge to make a solution work consistently all over the world.
Absolutely. Now, could you kind of talk a little bit more about, if you think about the logistics industry as a whole and kind of just the history of it, how has digital transformation kind of become a valuable tool in the growth of kind of what's possible and kind of where, helping move the industry forward, and specifically focus on the logistics industry side of things?
Well, it's interesting in the sense that to some extent, the logistics industry, has a tried and true way of operating, and they're somewhat resistant to change. But it's really been the consumer aspect and the proliferation of all the wireless devices and smartphones, and really, even when you order something from Amazon and can watch that delivery coming to your door, it's been those expectations of visibility, and button click access to information on what you've purchased or what's being delivered, that's actually driving a lot of the change, because the consumer can see this technology can work for their individual shipments. Of course, businesses are now expecting that same type of visibility. So it's been the consumer industry back pressure has really forced the logistics industry to start embracing this type of technology and the IoT capabilities it brings. Because really, if you think about the granularity of data that can be collected, and the fact that everybody is motivated to move to kind of a just-in-time supply chain to save costs, increase velocity of business, it's really a great natural fit. And we've been working with customers for quite some time that were early adopters and have moved from pilots and trials many years ago to now full rollouts, and they're seeing quite a bit of benefit. And certainly some of the customers we worked with that were prepped ahead of time with technology to deal with vaccine distribution, that was a huge benefit. And I think generally speaking, the world's response to COVID and understanding that those vaccines had to be really tightly controlled and necessitated this type of visibility technology in the supply chain has only further pushed people to realize it's not a matter of if you need this, it's just a matter of when and who you partner with to roll it out. So, I think the industry now knows this is the direction it's going, but you still have your interesting challenges in the sense of trying to take technology enablement into a traditionally paperwork-driven process where there's a lot of data silos in the industry. The technology exists to build those bridges, but it's really just a matter of taking people who are used to doing business in one way, seeing the value of tools to enhance that business tomorrow, and taking them on a journey to get there, which, depending on the appetite of our individual customers, can move very quickly, or can really take a couple years to get that journey headed in the right direction and move into a really good controlled rollout. Because at the end of the day, it's the customers who think about how this technology gets enabled at the edge, and the fact that their workforce needs to adopt and understand how to work with it. It can't be something that's just driven from the C-suite without taking a lot of time to tangibly consider what the boots on the ground need to do to fully embrace and use the solution. In many cases, it can actually enhance and make their business easier and remove steps from the equation. But it is with all things, it's a matter of adoption and really thinking about what does a day in the life look like from every user's perspective to make sure the solution is fit for purpose. And at least from OnAsset's point of view, we have never met any two customers that are exactly the same.
Sure.
One of the biggest drawbacks we see in the IoT industry in general is some of the bigger players that try to sell a one size fits all type solution, and don't have a mindset of really engaging with the customer and embracing the fact that you need to tweak or tune the dials of the solution to their specific business needs. That's something I've actually organized OnAsset to do, and we're very proud of, that we can take a product that exists and is somewhat standardized, but then we can customize aspects of that product to make it work exactly the way the customer needs to.
Well, and it's kind of a requirement these days in the IoT space. If you think about the variables that come into play, especially in the logistics space across the entire supply chain, every solution is a different kind of asset that's being tracked. The data that's required, is different for each of those assets. The environment in which those assets are living in is different. There's so many different variables that tie in and then eventually influence the ROI for the customer, which at the end of the day is their decision-making point on whether or not this solution is going to work or not for them. So I don't really think you can do the one size fits all and actually get the true benefit of the IoT solution in a variety of different applications, at least, not from my experience.
I couldn't agree with what you said more. You stated it very well. And that's something I think the industry is starting to understand, but we do meet customers often that have gone to larger suppliers and find issues where, not everybody can start with a full rollout day one, right? You need to grow in and plan for that, to do it in a controlled way to make it successful. And we do meet a lot of customers who, try to do that with some larger companies that don't necessarily have the mindset or try to force them into, a very large volume commitment before they'll start doing some of that tweaking or tuning. And it really just creates static in the sales cycle. And that's a place where we can step in and make things happen much more quickly.
Now, let me ask you, when you are working with a variety of different customers across different industries, different applications, that kind of thing, how do you all help these customers really understand the value of that real-time data that, and the solution you're bringing to them as something that they should invest their time, their resources, and money into that will, overall make a very large impact of the daily operations, and then obviously be able to use that data in ways they probably never envisioned? How do you kind of educate them on that? How do you, help customers understand that value?
I mean, the real answer to that question is you've got to kind of come from the mountaintops of singing the high level value proposition and get down into the valleys with them and really start to understand, what are the features that they need? How can it be implemented? In a lot of cases, we deal with customers who have, legacy IT systems that they can't just rip out and change, but that maybe aren't even set up to kind of absorb, real-time location and sensor data by the minute or second. So, there's a lot of blocking and tackling you have to do by first of all, just listening to your customer and understanding their business as much as you can to kind of fit your solution to their needs. And then, really very early in the process, you need to start having those discussions about, what does deployment look like? What system integrations are required? Who needs to share data? Where does it need to go? Who makes decisions and how do they make decisions based on this data? Those pieces are important to get on the table and talk through early, because I can tell you through all of my experience, it is almost never a scenario where the technology doesn't deliver on the value promise.
Sure.
It always gets bogged down in the implementation cycle or people not thinking through, the aspects of global implementation and simple things like, if you are a global company, do people need to ingest this data or be delivered in a secondary language? What are the operating times across the globe that people need to be supported? It's simple things like that I think you have a danger of coming later in the discussion. We try to really bubble those up and get those out early, because at the end of the day, it's never an issue of does our product deliver on its value promise. It's always a matter of how you make sure the business is set to accept that value and roll it out in a controlled way.
Gotcha. And when you're working with these customers, how's the process been for moving them from kind of after you've educated and you kind of help them understand the value, you get them into a pilot and some kind of trial, and then you move them into, or you're hoping to move them into these large scale rollouts? What have been the biggest challenges associated with that, and kind of advice you may have for companies that kind of are looking to be able to accomplish the same thing at a pretty high success rate like you have been able to?
Yeah, I think, it's multifaceted in the sense that certainly with us, we serve probably the two most regulated industries in the world in pharmaceuticals and aviation. So, number one is you've got to make sure that the partner you pick has the appropriate pedigree to, address the specific needs of your industry or the vertical business you're in. There's I think a desire for some companies to find a one size fits all provider, very large company with a marquee name, but to a large extent, those kind of people don't have expertise in applying IoT solutions to specific product verticals. So you've got to make sure you've got the right partnership and that you really have in focus early in the exchange, the regulatory requirements, testing requirements, all of those things, so that you're all engaging in a way that's kind of eyes wide open. The other thing you've got to do is plow the road to make sure the benefits of what you're delivering can be absorbed and used. Again, but kind of back to that point where you've got to have the back end systems that can absorb the type of data granularity that's generated, so that ultimately, you can trigger rules and events and business processes to actually gain not just visibility and peace of mind through the solution, but actually operational implementation and change. So those are big parts. The other just interesting challenge is, we try to make a single solution that works in a consistent fashion all over the world. I think there's quite a few, upstart companies in IoT that have the perception, You can buy a module here, pop a SIM card in it there, throw a plastic housing and a battery on it, and now you've got a product. It's not quite that easy. And there are, so many road bumps and hurdles you run into when you try to deploy a product to the four corners of the world and support things through, roaming relationships that are 2 or 3 levels removed. It's an interesting challenge, and you have to have a support organization set up, to absorb and deal with that. So that's another, learning. I think a lot of people go through that curve, but it's not trivial, and it's not as simple as some make it out to be. But that being said, with the right kind of mindset and the right understanding, and really trying to be eyes wide open with the customer and what not only needs to be accomplished in the trial or pilot, but what does that end state look like 3 to 5 years from now? You've got to have those conversations early in the cycle to make sure everybody's eyes wide open and not stumbling.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And now, do you all work? I mean, I know you do, but when you are working in these industries that are highly regulated, that have a lot more kind of processes to follow, have a lot more things that need to kind of be reviewed and understood before they venture into a solution like this, what are the challenges that you found being able to deliver, the expected results in an industry that is highly regulated and maybe often resistant to, adopting these types of technologies?
Certainly there's a timeline element of it, in the sense of in highly regulated industries, you typically have to go through a lot of checks and balances, quality audits, security audits, mapping to regulations, and that just takes time. So what we try to do, is develop that to the extent we can relative to just the aspects of our solution, and then we engage with the customer to flesh it out and create the full package. And that, it depends a lot. It's different for each customer in the sense of how they're architected, what IT tools they're using, what third-party products they may be using in combination. Because certainly in the pharmaceutical space, there's temperature-controlled packaging that we may need to integrate or work with. That's also an additional test cycle. So there's those aspects, and then frankly, just the foundation of coming to the table with some of that regulatory pedigree already delivered. We're one of the few players in the market that has all of our equipment approved for use on aircraft, and we design all of our stuff to be fully compliant with aviation regulations. Because again, if you're deploying real-time supply chain visibility, especially for a global operation, there's almost always some aspect of air cargo or air movement involved in that. So, we tried to tackle the hardest regulatory aspect first, and it's that much easier than to take our solutions and use it for ground, intermodal, rail transport, whatever the customer may need to do, because our goal is kind of a one-stop shop for all of those different modes of transport. So you have a visibility solution that's based on standardized technology, is delivered consistently and works the same way globally. So you don't have to have, regionalized fleets that you manage in different ways based on where they're being used. The global supply chain, the velocity is just increasing day over day. Everybody wants it faster. They want it more just in time. And to do that, you've got to have something that's flexible to deal with all those different environments.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Now, one question I did have is, knowing just about the supply chain and the logistics space, there are lots of other software platforms that are being used throughout the entire journey there. And I wanted to get a better understanding of how you all kind of approach integrating with and working with, other supply chain systems, ERP systems, things like that. And why the need for kind of an integration into kind of your offering and that real-time data, kind of how that all works together to maximize the value of those platforms when kind of brought together with what you guys have.
Sure. Well, as you know, there are a huge variety of platforms that have come on the market, I think due in large part to, what I mentioned, that a lot of legacy systems weren't really set up to absorb or utilize real-time visibility data effectively. So these platforms now have a home, and there are some people out there with a lot of funding and massive valuations building these kind of real-time supply chain orchestration, visibility and management platforms. And our perspective is that in order for those platforms to really have the most value they can to the customer, is you've got to have quality real-time data at the edge and injected into them. It's a particular pet peeve of mine that I think a lot of those players go to market really touting, all of the different data feeds that they can bring to the table, and they can pull from all of these different sources, and they're agnostic as to the IoT device landscape, and will integrate with everyone. What we see, though, peeling the onion on that and looking from the inside, is in a lot of those cases, these systems are great. They have excellent capabilities, but they're making their decisions and presenting their data based upon data feeds that aren't timely, aren't necessarily accurate, are 2 or 3 layers removed from the actual source of the data. And they're starting to make these decisions and do things like predictive arrival times, and they're getting it wrong purely because they're not spending as much time as they should really looking at the quality of the data they're feeding into the system that's now automating these business decisions. And I really think they're doing, in some ways, the whole customer base a disservice by being agnostic and trying to chase more data integrations when it's really looking at the integrations you have. It's the 80-20 rule. There's probably a small handful of data feeds that actually do the lion's share of decision making in those platforms. And I really do think we're going to see in the future a culling of that market, where instead of the approach of, I'm agnostic and doing business with everybody and pulling feeds from all these places, there's going to be more focused business partnerships where people are really going to drive down to, which IoT solutions are generating that valuable data that's actually enabling these systems to make some sort of decisions or AI-based planning. And you're going to see a more focused group of partnerships that will materialize, because at the end of the day, it's the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. If you're not controlling the quality of what the system is ingesting, it's never going to give you the best output it can.
Absolutely. One of the last questions I had for you before we wrap up here is this is more of a general topic we talk about in a lot of our conversations, but it's usually, I try to have it focused somewhat towards the industry in which you all are focused on and working on a regular basis. And so as it relates to the logistics and supply chain space, how are you seeing an increased need for edge computing transitioning kind of away from the cloud computing side, or are you seeing the need for both, or kind of how's that kind of playing out right now in that space in particular?
I think there's a need for both. It's not one or the other. It's really a combination, and we see much more intelligence being pushed toward the edge. So I think there was potentially a wave of people pushing a narrative that IoT should get cheaper. The sensors and devices themselves should be cheap to the point of being throwaway per shipping event. And we really see the opposite of the future there, in the sense that there are some pretty hefty ESG and green initiatives from the major corporations that nobody wants to be throwing away millions of IoT devices in the trash every year. Plus, they want to derive deeper insights into what's happening at the edge. So instead of just kind of in a dumb way taking a huge data stream and forwarding that to the cloud, you can actually push some of that intelligence and filtering to the edge, so that the equipment that's out there can actually determine, what events do you really care about or are going to take action on. Because data for data's sake, there's a place for that. But at the end of the day, people are deploying these solutions to see a tangible business benefit. And it's much easier to have the IoT solution help filter and sharpen the tip of the spear on that data, and then send it to you, versus trying to just generate a whole lot of data for data's sake. And I think that ties in again into a more intelligent, equipping a more feature-rich device that you can then reuse and recirculate over 5 or 10 years. You're ultimately going to have a significantly better, significantly better return on your investment. because that equipment is reusable, it's intelligent enough to be configured and push some of that intelligence so that, what it's doing today can actually be changed tomorrow to, again, sharpen that edge even more and add more value. And, we don't think the future of a lot of IoT widgets that are very, very feature lean and don't do much more than just one thing, but are intended to be throwaway. That's not a vision that it seems like a lot of our customers are liking or sharing. Most people are talking about, devices that are a little bit more feature rich, can do more, can be configured over time. So it can't be a monolithic solution that's the same today as it needs to be tomorrow. It needs to be more flexible than that. But then, reuse and recirculate, not only for the benefit of the green aspects of that, but for the investment as well, because, you don't want to throw away assets, you want to reuse them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's fantastic. But I really appreciate kind of these insights. We haven't had too many experts come on and talk about logistics and supply chain in this detail. And I think what you all have going on and the approach you all are taking is the right one based on all the conversations that I've had and kind of the approaches that we've seen success in. So it sounds like you guys have a lot of great things going on, which is fantastic. I wanted to finish up and just have you, or I guess tell our audience where they can follow up and ask questions if they have any follow-ups after listening to this, and at the same time, if there's anything new and exciting coming out from OnAsset in the coming months that our audience should be on the lookout for.
Absolutely. Well, you can find us online at www.onasset.com. We're also on LinkedIn under OnAsset Intelligence. So you can find all the info on our products and where we're going. We definitely have some new products we're releasing later this year. So the best place to stay tuned is on the website. We'll typically do a press release and then put it on the site so everybody can see the details. But being in the technology space, it's a constant roll of new products, new services, and we've got a full team dedicated just toward kind of growing our solutions and then customizing those solutions for individual customer needs. So, you've got to kind of keep going in the technology space. You can never just sit in your chair and rest. That's old hat for us. It's just the way we work. But best place to stay tuned is on our website. And I certainly appreciate you having us on, Ryan. It's been great chatting with you. And I always love to talk to people who are in the industry and really see it from the inside out. It sounds like we share a lot of similar vision there.
Great. Yeah, it's been fantastic. Thanks for taking the time to do this. I think, our audience is going to get a lot of value out of it, and we can chat more offline about other ways we can get kind of what you're doing out in front of our audience. I'm sure there's other content you all are producing that they'd love to kind of stay up to date on what's going on, kind of, just collect more of that thought leadership that you all have. So we'll talk more about that later, but thanks again for being here. I really appreciate it.
Good stuff. Thanks, Ryan.
All right, everyone. Thanks again for joining us this week on the IoT For All podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please leave us a rating or review and be sure to subscribe to our podcast on whichever platform you're listening to us on. Also, if you have a guest you'd like to see on the show, please drop us a note at ryan@iotforall.com and we'll do everything we can to get them as a featured guest. Other than that, thanks again for listening and we'll see you next time.